Okay, this is English 101, Week 13, Part 2, Spring 2021. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So I'm gonna read that first paragraph again. I think it's pretty important here. It might be useful to distinguish between pleasure and joy, but maybe everybody does this very easily all the time, and only I am confused. A lot of people seem to feel that joy is only the most intense version of pleasure, arrived at by the same road. You simply have to go a little further down the track. That has not been my experience. And if because a lot of people I think imagine that like if you eat food it can be pleasurable, but if you eat like the best food of your life, that's joy. She thinks joy is something else, and that it's not just additional pleasure or a maximum version of pleasure. She doesn't quite say what she thinks it is, but we'll talk about it. That has not been my experience. And if you asked me if I wanted more joyful experiences in my life, I wouldn't be sure. I'm trying this again. I hate this sentence. And if you asked me if I wanted more joyful experiences in my life, I wouldn't be at all sure I did exactly, because it provokes such a difficult emotion. It proves such a difficult emotion to manage. It's not at all obvious to me how we should make an accommodation between joy and the rest of our everyday lives. Accommodation, there, and if you look it up in the dictionary, it can be a little confusing because the definition number one of accommodation is like a house that you live in. But the second definition of accommodation is like a compromise. And she says the problem with joy is, she says, it's not at all obvious to me how we should make an accommodation between joy and the rest of our everyday lives, meaning there's no compromise between the everyday and joy. She thinks there's no middle ground. There's no real connection between the two of them. Everyday lives can't have joy in them, and joy is not about something everyday. I think at this point I should probably read more of the essay, but I feel like she doesn't super clearly define this. Maybe she does, but I think she doesn't super clearly define this. And so I think it's actually more helpful if I define it right now. I think you're supposed to read the essay and be slightly confused the whole time and figure out the difference between joy and pleasure on your own. I think for purposes of our class, since there's a test on this, it might be easier if I just said what I think she thinks the difference is. And then that way you would know it and you could sort of have it the whole time. I'm cold. I'm going to put on a jacket. So, what is the difference between joy and pleasure, according to her? And again, just like Socrates says he has to define love, and he defines it in a weird way, and just like Walker wants to define fear in a weird way, she's gonna define love and joy in a strange way. So let's figure out what the hell she's talking about. Um, so you know what pleasure is? It's just things you enjoy, things that are enjoyable, right? You get a good sandwich, that's pleasurable. You hang out with your friends, that's pleasure. Playing video games is pleasure. Playing a sport is pleasure. Right? There's all kinds of things that we find going. I love going to the movies. Pleasurable. I love reading books. I love reading fucking Plato. That's probably a terrible example because y'all hate Plato. But anyway, I like I like reading books and I find it pleasurable. I love going to the movies. I find it pleasurable. I love delicious food from all kinds of countries, Thai food especially. That's definitely my favorite. Um, right? These are pleasurable experiences. So that's an easy one. I think she agrees with everybody about what pleasure is. Most people will tell you that joy is really just an extreme form of pleasure. So that if right, again, I think I said this in the last video, but like if I eat a sandwich, that's pleasure. But if it's like the best food I've ever had in my life, that's joy. She doesn't think that's joy. Um, what she is thinking of here um, is that joy is such an extreme form of pleasure that it can blow up your whole life. That's why she says at the last sentence, I think the last sentence of the first paragraph is super important. She says, it's not obvious to me how we should make an accommodation, meaning a compromise or a settlement between joy and the rest of our everyday lives. She thinks that your everyday life and joy don't go together. Why? Because what she's thinking of when she says joy is an experience that is so wonderful and so powerful that it will change your whole life. She says she doesn't want to experience more joy in her life. And that seems strange, right? Don't you want to have as much joy as possible in your life? But she says in that first paragraph, if you asked me if I wanted more joyful experiences in my life, I wouldn't be at all sure I did. Um, because it proved such a difficult emotion to manage. Joy, it's really not worth going into this, but there's a French word, jouissance, that captures much better what she's talking about here. What she's talking about when she says joy is a pleasure that is so extreme that it can change or overthrow or wreck your life. What is she thinking of? Well, I think at least one thing she is thinking of is the radical experience of falling in love real hard. Um, it's that complicated thing where something can be so pleasurable it's almost painful. If you've ever fallen deeply in love with somebody, like romantically. And Socrates, again, we spent a whole fucking semester talking about love. If you've ever fallen deeply in love with someone romantically, it can be such a shock to the system and totally incompatible with your everyday life. So you have a life and a routine where you see your friends and you play video games and you go out and do stuff. When you fall in love, it may be such an extreme feeling that you stop doing regular everyday things, and now you're not talking to your best friend anymore very much because you're ignoring text messages from people in your life, and you're not going to work, and you can't pay attention in school, and you're right because you're totally in romantic love with somebody, and so that you can't think straight. Because it's such an extreme form of pleasure that it fucks up your life. And the idea is when you have pleasure, it fits into your life, right? You can you can have a day and go to work and get a sandwich, and the sandwich is pleasurable, and then you go back to work. But if you're deeply in love with somebody, and this goes for like sexual entanglements also, it can be such an intense experience that you feel like you can't get back to your regular life. So, like, for starters, if you're married and then you fall in love with somebody that isn't your husband, whoo, that is going to throw your life out of fucking control. You may feel joy that you've fallen in love with somebody new, but it's a kind of tricky, painful joy that threatens to blow up your whole life. And to give another example, I think certain kinds of drugs, like heroin, are so pleasurable I mean, people do drugs because it gives them good feelings. But some people experience drug use to be so pleasurable that that's all they want to do, and their lives are destroyed. You usually don't see, I mean, people do compare love to drugs a lot. There's a famous 80s song where a guy says, I want a new drug that, like how I feel about you. So actually, I should find that song. I'm gonna make a note to myself to put that song on the playlist so you can hear that song. I want a new drug. It's actually a pretty good song. Hold on, I'm making a note. Drug song. Okay. Um, so it's a feeling that's so pleasurable. I think her definition of joy is like falling in love or becoming addicted to heroin. It's like so intense feeling that you can't just have your day-to-day life be normal anymore because this changes everything. So if you're a drug addict, the pleasures of drugs are so extreme that you stop going to work and you're robbing people for money to pay for your drugs, and right, it like fucks up your whole life. Alcohol, like any kind of thing. But falling in love would also fuck up your life, right? Because especially if you're like already married to somebody else, but even like you may fall in love with somebody that your parents hate who's a different religion. And then, like, you know what I mean? And that's joy because you're in love with somebody and it's this very intense feeling, but also it's going to blow up your life, which is why Zadie Smith says she's not sure she wants more pleasure in her life. Everybody wants pleasure, but Zadie Smith is not sure she wants joy in her life because it's so pleasurable. It's destructive. It's really different from pleasure because pleasure is like, oh, that's nice. But joy is like the kind of thing that will blow up your life. I realize I spent a lot of time on this, but I think without understanding that distinction, the rest of the essay doesn't make sense. I'm hoping we can go faster now, but that was the first paragraph. I'll see you in the next video.